Good. All right. What time is it over there?
It is 10:30 in the evening.
Oh, okay. And you're not in the UK anymore, right? You're
No, I'm in Sweden.
Sweden. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So you've been there for a while too, right? So you've been.
Yeah, about a year and a few months.
Yeah. Do you like it so far?
Yeah, it's more culturally different than you'd expect.
Yeah. Well, we were over there for actually an accessibility conference 2 years ago now, I think a year and a half ago, and it was very different, but very welcoming. Like everyone was really welcoming when we were there. So, but but they really like mayonnaise over there.
Yes, I've noticed that, and I'm not a big fan of mayonnaise.
Good.
So they have a very particular cuisine, which I guess you could say for a lot of countries, especially a lot of European countries. And yeah, it's very hard to avoid if you don't like particular things.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, we went grocery shopping one day, and I just saw, American grocery stores are big and have a lot of items and everything like that. So it wasn't too shocking, but I saw this just one aisle of just tubes hanging from hooks.
Oh yeah, they
Just
love food in tubes.
yeah, and it was just that freaked me out like more than anything else. It was just like, what is tubes that they could just like take in the grocery store and like. So I walked up. It's like, oh, it's mayonnaise. I was like, well, this is a lot of effort to put mayonnaise in tubes, and like you just like have just a whole like section of like tubes, but like then I realized like there are different flavors of mayonnaise for going
Hmm.
throughout the thing, and I was just like, yeah, we could talk about mayonnaise forever, but yeah, I was just really kind of like, oh,
Oh, they like fish in tubes as well and things
yeah,
like that. Everything, cheese in tubes,
mm-hmm.
stuff in tubes.
Yes, exactly. Cool. But yeah, but it was wonderful. Had a wonderful time there. So I hope to get back soon and see everyone over there. But cool. But yeah, but thanks for being on the show. I think everything's working. Uh, can you record the audio on your end if you can?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
I've got that set up ready to go. So
Okay.
let me just right that. Yep, that looks like it's all good.
Cool. Awesome.
Do you want to do a clap or anything like
Oh yeah,
that?
sure. We just here we go. One, two. There we go.
Oh,
Oh, wait, we're gonna do it together. One, two,
do a countdown.
three, two,
One.
one. I think we're
It
like,
sounds very strange when you do it, but it works out at
okay.
the end.
All right. Cool. Well, thanks for being on the show. Um, for being here, and you have a new book coming out. Is this your first book that you've written?
Yes, this is my first book.
Oh wow! So how did the book come about? Well, first is the title of the book is Accessibility for Everyone. It's from a book part,
Yeah.
and congratulations on that's a great publisher to work with. And so, how did the idea for the book come about?
Well, I wasn't necessarily thinking about writing a book,
Hmm.
and it's been a long time in the works. So I think Jason Santamaria came to me at the end of 2013
Wow.
and said, "Oh, I've read some of the things you've written on accessibility, and we think it would be cool if you thought about would you like to write a book about it?" And I mean, for me, that's quite a terrifying prospect. Like, professional, expert people write books, not people like me.
Right.
And so I thought about it, and I thought about a book apart who had published things like responsive web design, for one, and sort of the first books on HTML and CSS, and just really, really good reads. And I thought, well, what if we could get accessibility in front of that audience, the people who are reading books like responsive web design? Like,
Mm.
that could make a huge difference to the accessibility of the web in general
Right.
if we did that. So I kind of thought, well, it's not an opportunity I can pass up. I want that to be something that happens. I want people to be talking about accessibility. I want people to be making their sites more accessible.
Right.
And so it's been a long time writing it. It's gone through various stages and kind of life events getting in the way.
Right.
But I'm really pleased with what we've got now. I think it's going to be a really good book.
Yeah, and so it's called Accessibility for Everyone. So I guess it's sort of a just kind of an introduction to accessibility for everyone. So it's like in the book apart, I think Zeldman talks about the books as being like a airplane reads, if you will.
Yeah.
That, you get on an airplane and you get off it, you have a good understanding of that. So it's a good overview of what accessibility is for people. So
yeah, that's the idea. I don't know whether mine might be a slightly longer flight to read. We've done a lot of work to actually get it down to being the most important elements that we could talk about, because you could cover a huge amount when you're talking about accessibility. Once you start uncovering the kinds of things that inclusive design involve. So we're not just talking about designing for people with disabilities. That's something that people generally think about when they think about accessibility. They think about, oh, how can I make my website accessible to screen readers? That's the common thing. How can I make it accessible to specifically blind people using screen readers? In the same way that when we're talking about how to make a building accessible, people will be like, oh, it's all about how to make a building accessible to people using wheelchairs. But actually, when we're talking about accessibility, the different parts of the web that are affected by different impairments, different abilities, different geographical locations, different contexts, different cultures, different languages. When we start talking about trying to make the web inclusive to all of these different things, and I could keep going, that's the kind of accessibility I wanted to talk about, is really including specific disabilities and impairments and how to address some of those needs, but also how can we go wider? How can many of the solutions that we might provide for example, a screen reader user, how that could also accommodate people who are perhaps using a translation plugin in order to understand your website. You need to have good text for that. You need to have clear copy, well-written copy, that perhaps might also make it easier for people with learning difficulties to read and understand, because you're not filling it with loads of jargon and stuff like that. So all of these different things that come off thinking more inclusively when you're designing. And some of the everybody part is also the people that it takes to make a website accessible, because it isn't just a developer who has to write good HTML and separate out HTML from CSS from JavaScript. It's also about having good copywriters. It's also having designers who understand color contrast and perhaps people with color blindness and things like that. And it's also about having people that can create a structure and navigation that are easy to use. Maybe if people have cognitive difficulties or memory difficulties, being able to accommodate those needs as well.
Yeah, I definitely would say it's about clear copy. It's the writing, I've written books for a while now, and if you told me when I was in school that I would have written a ton of books for web developers, I would tell you you're crazy, because I would never be a person to. I don't consider myself a professional, but because as you said, web design books written by professionals. I'm like, what? But yeah, and I've gotten more critical of copy as I've written more books, but also I guess as a user, in that when I read articles for web development, and if there's the cliches or there's vernacular that's more in a culture or memes or whatever like that.
Yeah.
And that's what you're using to get your main point across. You can use it as like a supporting argument. That's great. But if you want people to actually understand it, and I like the idea of people are going to come in and use Google Translate to figure out what you're trying to say. And if you use something that's really like a joke that only a few people will get, then your content's going to be lost.
Or even going between our language, because we both speak English, but you speak a different type of English from me. So if I use a Britishism or something that's particular to British culture, you're not necessarily going to grasp that as quickly. It's the same with things like pop culture references and stuff like that. It's not the same everywhere. One of the things when I moved to Sweden, I started realizing how different things were, even in terms of just silly things like, oh, you get different geolocated content from me. I'll go on a website and all the ads are in Swedish. Yeah. Doesn't really matter that my Swedish is pretty rubbish, but I'll still get those ads in that language.
Right. Yeah, it's like it's also really weird. Like when I was in Sweden too, it was just like I would surf like a website I would normally surf, but then all of a sudden it's just like they just auto give me Swedish, and I was just like, oh, okay, I guess that's kind of cool and weird, I guess,
Or
but
make an assumption that because you're in a country, you want to shop in that country's store, or
right,
you want to pay in that country's currency, as well as speaking that country's language.
right,
And as everyone says, flags are not languages,
yeah,
and that's a very key thing too.
yeah, that's right, that's cool, cool statement, pretty awesome. And then also want to talk about yeah, so I mean, content strategy is really important, and so I think that's a whole different topic before. I mean, we've had Christina Halverson on and talk about content strategy before, so that's like a huge industry in itself right now. So I also want to talk about like teams and like I know I had like not too long ago I ran like pretty much just this morning I got an advanced copy of your book.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I just like literally just got it. I was
So you
like,
had a little skim.
yeah, I was just like, I usually like to read all the books before I interview people, but literally they were like, yeah, we might not have it ready for you yet. So I was like, so they were very polite and working to give me a advanced copy. And so one of the things you mentioned, like you mentioned earlier, just about making sure you have a team with you. And so look, we've done accessibility conferences, and this issue. Usually with accessibility conferences, people usually it's like speaking to the choir. Like you don't need to convince people. But have you ever thought about? I don't know if you've written this in your book or your thoughts about this. Is like ways to get people to help them convince others in their team or their superior, like their boss or something like that, to that accessibility is important. I know obviously the book as a whole, I think is a good piece to get people to talk about that. But any like techniques or something like that to help people.
Well, generally, like everything, it's much easier if you get this kind of guidance from the top, or if a project manager or someone is really leading with this. But that can be quite wishful thinking, and it's not often what occurs. And you may be a lone developer or a designer that's trying to push for accessibility inside your team. And small changes can make a difference. Like just what you do in your own work can make a huge difference, even if it's you're making sure that you're using meaningful elements when you're writing HTML.
Yes,
you're not just slinging a load of divs and spans in there. You're actually choosing, oh, that's a paragraph, that's a list, and navigation. And with HTML5, we have a whole host of more semantic, meaningful elements to use in order to describe things, which makes a huge amount of different types of accessibility much better. But I think one of the best things you can do is have a diverse team to begin with. Not just, I think it's very difficult. This is a hot topic, as it should be across the industry right now, is that we don't have a diverse enough teams in terms of it is mostly young, white, cis, straight men, and usually with a certain level of education and things like that. As soon as we start broadening out the diversity of our teams, we start getting this understanding that there are different people with, some people might have impairments, some people might wear glasses. I mean, you wear glasses, you lose your eyesight by a few more degrees, and you're suddenly going to have more difficulty. You get RSI in your wrist and repetitive strain injury, and then you suddenly can't use a mouse so easily, and maybe you're stuck using keyboard navigation. Maybe you just prefer using keyboard navigation, and we start understanding that different people use the web in different ways from us.
Right.
Then actually talking to other people that do have disabilities and impairments, just trying to watch people using our websites, just trying to understand how they might do it. You might know someone, a friend of a friend, who is perhaps blind. You might know someone who has a hearing impairment. You might want to test different things on your sites with them. You certainly would want to sort of run paid testing with people and researching with people in order to understand the wide range of needs out there. Once you start involving real humans in your research, you're going to pick up so much so quickly. You're going to learn so much about a few people, which will widen your horizons to a lot more people.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Like I think Matt May makes a point, and I think he's done a great number of presentations. But Matt May's accessibility, I think evangelist would be one, but he's also I think manager at Adobe, and so he's worked on a number of products we used to use Adobe Connect, and so it made that more accessible. But one of the things he always says in his speech is like, make websites accessible because you're going to be using them eventually down the road. I mean, eventually, like we all, like hopefully we all get older, but also that means we're going to lose the eyesight. Like you mentioned, like hopefully, like our impairment's going to slow down, and so we're going to like build websites that you're going to be using down the road, and you won't feel like locked out of your own content, pretty much. So.
Yeah, exactly that. And it's easy enough to now test on family and friends who might already be older than you or be at a different point in life. And also be aware that sometimes the impairments that we have are temporary things. Sometimes you might break your arm, you might have laser eye surgery.
Right. Yeah, temporary.
All these things that they're fleeting, but they still have an effect. And these are the kinds of experiences that you'll suddenly realize how much you needed to use a website and how inaccessible it was. It's one of the things I think that in Eric Mayer and Sarah Watcher-Betcher's book, Design for Real Life, covers really well, is these situations of stress, these stress cases. And when you really need something is when you realize how much you need it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, because definitely the whole thing with like even temporary like impairment, like breaking, like if you have an arm in a cast or whatnot. So I also want to talk about like if you could explain like what there's a screen readers that I think people are more familiar with, but what other ways, what other impairments, and what ways do people use the web besides like a screen reader?
And so I often map it to a few different particular areas, and I think that they map very well to usability areas. Mm-hmm. So things that affect eyesight. Mm-hmm. So generally that's the things that you will see on a page or you cannot see on a page. You have things that affect your hearing, which are things that you can or can't hear on a page. You have things that affect your motor functions. So that's generally affecting your input types. So whether you can use a mouse, whether you use a keyboard, whether you use something like eye scanning, eye tracking technology, or you could use a kind of a single button input. And then also there's cognitive impairments which you have. So these are the things that are the way that your brain works and the way that you read things, the way that you understand numbers and structure and letters. And then the other group is kind of, well, it's not really a group, but loosely I tend to group them together, is things like seizures. You don't want to cause people to have seizures. And also, why have I lost the word? Motion sensitivity. So when you've got things that will create, like motion will make your experience very uncomfortable, make you queasy. And so all of these things are broadly sort of usability based, and the accommodations you might make for these particular needs will also help with usability in general. It's simple things. Some of it's more expensive than others. So things like maybe you want to produce subtitles for your videos. That could be quite time consuming or expensive if you get a professional to do it. Right. But if you do that, that's huge. If you've, say, putting up a conference talk, having a transcript, I mean, it's very time consuming, could be very expensive. Right. But then if you're trying to convince someone of the business value of that, search engine optimization. Right. It's brilliant. You suddenly got all the text as searchable.
Right. Definitely. Yeah, I definitely see that. And so, yeah, it's definitely time consuming, and it is somewhat costly depending on how you go about doing it. Especially if it's, very. I find the more geeky or just more like industry specific that we do, like I find that most transcriptionists have a problem with the weird words in our vernacular, and it's like, well, what does this mean? And so it takes a while too, but yeah,
it can be handy to get someone who has a background in the industry.
Yeah, and so for our accessibility conferences that we do online, that we actually hire online captioning, and they always ask ahead of time for slides and what topics we're talking about, and they're looking for the keywords, they're looking for how to spell things correctly and all that stuff like that. In other words, they're being really professional about everything, so that's always good. But lost my train of thought for a second there. So, but
yeah. So then there's that's an example of how accessibility could be expensive sometimes,
Yeah.
there's also so many things that we can just integrate into our everyday processes that are free and take no additional time. Once you know about them, you do them, in the same way that you might accommodate things like performance, like how you might decide, oh, I'm going to compress my fonts in this particular way because it's more performant. You could do the same thing in, oh, I'm going to choose this particular font because, oh, it has all of the characters required for lots of different languages. It's not just the character set for Latin English. And, oh, I'm going to check the color contrast when I'm creating this logo to see what the colors work as text color and background color, to ensure that people with color blindness don't just see them merged into two muddy similar colors and making it very hard to read the text. So all these kind of little practices we can just integrate into what we do every day.
Right. Oh, that reminds me of like where I was going before I lost my train of thought. But is that it amazes me that a lot of JavaScript engineers, or front-end engineers, if you will, they just don't know this HTML. Like you talked about, making sure things are semantic, and we have HTML5 now. But and also it worries me with some of the JavaScript frameworks that we have. Like people throw around divs pretty easily, but hopefully it's also like web components, so it's a bit, you can write one component, it doesn't, you write it well, you don't have to like, it's easier than people maintaining a whole like website, but it amazes me how people just, they don't know how to write semantic HTML, and that gets you like most of the way there in terms of
it's huge, and it's not difficult, and that's the thing. I find learning a lot of frameworks and things like that difficult and confusing. Right. Maybe learning a new programming language can be difficult and confusing. Right. HTML's pretty straightforward. Right. You're not having to worry about learning sort of wildly different syntaxes or different ways to punctuate and having fights about things like that. Mm-hmm. It's just about finding the element that's most appropriate. I think where that does become slightly trickier is things like templating, and that's why using a lot of frameworks that especially create front end can end up with some of the worst HTML, because they're trying to make one size fits all, and the nature of content is that not all of our content's the same. And when we come to interactive things, and because now these flashy web apps and things like that, they're bringing in whole new ways of interacting, whereas a lot of HTML was originally designed to mark up documents. Right. But we can still use a lot of the existing interactive elements. I think that people go, oh, well, it's not suitable because it's for documents, and throw it out without really understanding the value of the interactive things we already have. I mean, just putting a proper href on an anchor link rather than relying on JavaScript to get you to another place. The amounts of sites I go to and I see, if you turn off JavaScript, you can't click a link. I mean, the basis of the web is links. You should be able to do that.
Yeah. I think it's kind of amazing. Like people, I'm a big CSS nerd, and so there's lots of, there's a whole debate about CSS and JavaScript, but at the same time, I wish more people knew HTML, and I don't know, just buy some HTML flashcards or something. I don't know, just so they would know what's available. Because once they know what's available, what an HTML element is supposed to mean, and like it's not rocket science. It's not like learning no JavaScript framework. It's just something you need to know in the back of my head, so that we avoid divitis, soup.
And it's such a key part of accessibility, because one of the main ways in which a browser's accessibility layer that communicates with things like assistive technology, so maybe a braille output, a screen reader, and other things like that, switch controls, they interact with what the browser is finding is meaningful content. And if you are not giving it meaningful content, if you're not giving the content a specific meaning, if you're just going, oh, here's a div, here's another span, here's another div, here's another span, you're not saying, oh, well, here's the button where you actually submit the form on this site. Here are form elements, and this is your expected input. And now we're seeing, even with HTML5, we're seeing things like being able to input email specifically as an input type. Being able to input dates and things like that. Once the browser knows that's what you require for that input field. It can add a lot of flashy stuff on top of that, as browsers do, some of them consistently, some of them less so. If you think about something like the wheel you get on iOS coming up to scroll picking dates and things like that, compared to how it might appear just on a desktop browser. And those same advantages can be provided to assistive technology, allowing people to interact with it in a way that is most useful to them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, back in the day, we had this issue of like people, I think, taking over the scroll bar from the browser because they didn't like the scroll bar for some odd reason. Like, I don't know why.
Really ugly.
Yeah, just like, oh, yeah, we wanted to, like, oh, why would you want to do that? Just, and let people, and of course they wouldn't, dictate, like there's one news website, I'm not going to mention it, but I have and it's not the news website's fault, but I think it's an extension I have, and I have to go figure out which extension it is, but because they don't code it correctly, I can't go to this news website and scroll. Like they take over the scroll bar for some reason on this one site because there's some JavaScript conflict on it. So, but yeah, but yeah, I don't. Again, it's just I think the issue is just rely on the browser's default inputs. Not that you have to go crazy and just use the default styling of them, but just making sure that you actually use them. And then, like you said, I think letting the browser do most of the work.
Well, and that's for CSS. Like it's so easy to style those elements. It's not tricky. I mean, back when I started out, you had to really write different CSS to work in different browsers, and that was the normal thing to do. We don't have to worry about that anymore. I mean, yeah, we've got to worry about different devices and things like that, but you can be fairly sure about how something's going to render reasonably consistently across browsers. And it might vary in size and shape and structure a little bit, but the rest is going to be fairly simple. And so you don't have to hijack things anymore. You don't have to do those kinds of hacks and workarounds. You just write a simple CSS for a particular element, and also that will help you with your style guide and stuff like that, because all of the buttons look like this by default. I know that because I've styled it on the button element. Simple as that. You don't have to worry about which class name you're going to use that everybody can remember. Everybody knows it's a button.
Yeah, and then and it's a whole lot easier to style forms because in form elements, because I think in like 2004 or it's like 2003, one of my talks I usually gave was like the most depressing talk about web design I ever gave was the fact that you could not style input forms consistently across. Like you can maybe do a little things with the radio button, but that was it. You couldn't do anything with the select box or anything like that. So people now have. So you see a lot of people still to this day just hijack the select drop-down box because they think it's ugly and they can't design consistency.
Yeah, and the thing is that the select box has built into it accessibility so that people can tab between different options, people can move their mouse to choose between different options, people can press enter, people can click. If you're not using the existing HTML element for that, you don't have to rewrite all of that functionality in JavaScript. It's just a waste of time.
Right. Definitely. And then, so I do want to talk about like tools and services that are out there for people to check for accessibility concerns. I know Nobility is a local company in Austin, Texas, and if you contact them, they can actually work with you and actually get people to test your websites that have disabilities and impairments and give you a report based off like how accessible your sites are. And so that's really great. I know there's other companies out there that they'll do the same too and run reports and stuff like that too. But are there any tools that you liked about accessibility testing that people can use?
Yeah, well, one very basic one would be the W3C validator. If you're writing good HTML, that will give you a good start. There's also Wave, which comes in toolbar format for a lot of browsers as well. And that will give you a quick automated test on different accessibility things against the W3C's accessibility guidelines. And so it will tell you things like if the contrast between your background and foreground isn't right, if you haven't put alternative text on your images, if you've have redundant links where you've sort of got millions and millions of the same link going to the same place unnecessarily. And lots of little things like that. And it will also give you nice green ticks if it thinks you've done things well, which is quite nice if you need a bit of reassurance that you're going along the right path. I think automated tools can be quite tricky because they don't often pick up on the human elements, and you can only test one page at a time. So you're not necessarily going to pick up on things throughout somebody's journey through your site. But they can be pretty good for that. And then there's things like Tenon, which you can put into the build processes and things like that of your site, so that you can sort of, when you're really going in development, you can have tests that are going against the accessibility guidelines and things like that. Set your own too.
Cool. Awesome. Cool, yeah. And and one of the things, just to wrap it up, I think one of the things, like early on when I was trying to learn web design and learn about like all the different parts that make our industry up, and we have content strategy, we have design, we have like what's now front end engineering, but I always thought that UX, user experience, and accessibility just went together, like, but yet there's like the separation between the two of them. That there's user experience and accessibility, but I just felt like to have a really great user experience, you actually have to be accessible at the same time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I'd say the thing is that it's also a cross-cutting concern for every different role inside a team, right. Because it's not something developers can ignore. It's not something that the people writing the copy can ignore. It's not something people designing text or even picking typography right. can ignore. So it really has to be something that a whole team unites over in order to make something that's really valuable and really useful for as many people as possible.
Yep, agreed. That's awesome. Cool. Do you have any future projects you're working on? I know you're probably just wrapping up the book still. Maybe I'm not sure the status of the book.
Well, the book is pretty much done.
Okay.
So it will be released very soon. Cool. I'm wary of saying specific dates in case things don't go right, but very soon, I promise.
Okay.
And you can sign up to find out about that on the A Book Apart website. And what I'm working on the rest of the time is, as part of Indie, our tiny 2-person social enterprise, we have a web privacy tool that prevents websites from tracking you across the web and protects your privacy. And that's an iOS and Mac app that has a strong web element to it. And that's what I spend a lot of my time working on at the moment.
Cool, awesome. And I do use the iOS one for sure. I'm looking at the Mac one, but thank you guys for doing that. That's awesome.
Oh, cool. I'm so glad you use it.
That's great. Cool. And where can people find more about these projects and find you on social media and all that stuff?
You can find me at laurakalbag.com. My surname is Kalbag. I'm Laura Kalbag on Twitter and near enough everything else. Okay. And our website is ind.ie, and Better, our web privacy tool, is better.fyi.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This is really good fun.
Cool.